Greetings and good afternoon, family. Welcome to this week's Building Power. I am your host. I'm Sister Zakiya Sankara Jabbar. And today I am really excited about the guest that I have. Professor Dr. Tommy Curry is here to talk all things CRT. And we'll also talk a little bit about his work leading the burgeoning field of Black male studies. So Dr. Tommy Curry is an American scholar, author, professor of philosophy. He is currently holding personal chair of Africana philosophy and Black male studies at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome, Dr. Curry. Thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. You know, when all of this stuff started happening in the media, it seems like months now around CRT, you were the first person that I thought about. And I was finding myself like watching the news and things like that, like wanting for more. I'm like, wait, this is watered down. That ain't what I think CRT is. I'm like, no. Like, I'm sure I know what CRT is just from reading the work of Dr. Curry. And also, being very familiar with Derrick Bell's work. I actually learned about Derrick Bell, ironically enough, through you, really? Dr. Curry. Because you know, I have watched every single video that you've ever done if it's been published on YouTube, and I also have your book, The Man Not. So, you know, my entire family is fans of yours. We were talking about it. You and I were talking about this before we went live, but I know, you know, my brother-in-law, Kevin Foster, down at the University of Texas at Austin, he just made acting chair of the Africana Studies Department there. So we're proud of him. But anyway, what's up, man? How are you feeling? You want to tell the audience anything else that I didn't mention about who you are?
Nah, I'm from the South, and I came back home for the last few months, and this heat's killing me.
Right.
I've been in Scotland too long. I can't deal with the cold, and I can't deal with the heat anymore. I'm a displaced man.
Oh man. Well, I want to hop right into the conversation. I know lots of people were excited to see that you would be here today, including myself. But I want to read a quote from a piece that you published, or that was published on July 16th. So a couple weeks ago. With you sort of, you're so well read, and you can't do nothing that's short. This thing is 15 minutes long, but I encourage everybody to really read it, like read it and sit with it. But we're going to talk about some of the things that you highlighted. One of the first things that I know that caught my attention, and I've heard you say this a number of times, I'm going to read this quote. It says, and this is at the very, very beginning, we tend to think that racism will one day be overcome. But this belief in incremental progress isn't shared by many Black scholars. That much aligned and misunderstood founder of critical race theory, Derrick Bell, pronounced racism as a permanent feature of American society. His argument is that the very foundations of liberal democracy in the United States make equality between white and Black people impossible, and that might be hard to accept, but it remains valid, writes Dr. Tommy Curry. Can you unpack that for the audience? That's a lot.
It is, but I mean, look, in the most basic terms, white people will never see Black people as equal. I think that when you look at what is relatively a very short period of time between the enslavement of African descended people and African peoples throughout the world, we haven't had any substantial progress in the sense that Black people have been given and recognized as human beings. When we deal with things like police violence, when we deal with poverty, when we deal with all the issues that we keep talking about every day is anti-Black racism, we keep selling each other, every generation, every child, a dream that one day it'll be overcome. And today we've gotten to the point where we've watered down racism and racist oppression such that everything is like racism. So if you're disabled, if you're a woman, if you're, your sexual orientation or performance is different, it's the same thing as racism. So now it just becomes a part of these infinite series of marginalization within a society. Derrick Bell was not saying that. Critical race theorists weren't saying that. Critical race theory was saying, look, you have systems, institutions of power that are recognized and protected by the law that systematically oppress and eliminate Black people and people who descend to the United States social order, right? That is very different. When we compare the histories of other movements like feminism, you don't see the government ordering hits of feminists. You don't see
Well,
the government
tell it.
ordering hits of other kinds of white activists. Now, you may have white other vigilantes personally that go out and attack these people, but you don't have government sponsored and sanctioned actions by the FBI, the CIA, or even the education of infiltrators into Black student protest movements like the CIA did with people like Gloria Steinem as part of that history. So when you ask yourself, can racism be overcome? You say, well, by what means? Every other group, you have white women that do the Me Too movement, march on Washington in pink hats, not a single arrest, no protest. You have Black people with their hands up in their own neighborhoods, and cops are in military gear. So the whole perception or the whole realization of protest and resistance that Black people have in the United States has never been on an equal basis that respect their constitutional rights, their freedom of speech, or even the equal protection they're supposed to have under the law. So when Derrick Bell makes the claim that racism is permanent, he's not just giving a provocative argument, which is what a lot of people think is happening. He's saying that when you look from Brown v. Board of Education, which was his primary interest, all the way to 2000, 2010, 14, when he wrote his last book, he's saying that nothing's changed. Our rights are contingent. White people get upset, we lose rights. White people get in office, we lose rights. These are supposed to be God-given rights respected by the Constitution. No other group has to have their rights approved by the group that dominates and oppresses them, like Black people do in the United States. And that's why, right, Derrick's words about integration and the failure to actually have any kind of legal punishment for racists ring so powerfully. You could accuse someone of sexism in the academy, in the job, on national television, they lose their jobs. You could have someone systematically killing, brutalizing, and saying negative things about Black people, and they're given promotions. That's the difference. That there is a social recognition and compassion towards other marginalized groups, specifically white women, that don't exist for Black people. And until we start actually having a real conversation and not settling for the crumbs that white people hand us out as social and substantive progress, then I think that we have no other choice but to start thinking through the lens that Derrick Bell and Richard Delgado and Kenneth Nunn and other critical race theorists has given us, which is that the United States is permanently racist and it builds itself, it sustains itself on the subjugation of Black people.
So the United States is not only permanently racist, but specifically anti-Black, permanently anti-Black.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we got a lot of people here, a lot of people in the chat. Thank you all so much. You're not going to hear this on MSNBC, so make sure y'all get those likes up and share this broadcast with other folks to have them come join the conversation, because brother is already putting on the clinic. So Tommy, one of the things that I saw, and I have continued to see on MSNBC and other mainstream media sources here in the U.S., is that people are describing Kimberly Crenshaw as a founder, right? She actually has not corrected any of the that I have seen. And just keep in mind, I don't really have TV, so I usually see clips on social media or some other platform. But she has actually been accepting that title as the founder of critical race theory. And I remember when I first saw that, I said, that is so problematic. And why is Derrick Bell being erased? From your perspective, why do you believe that Derrick Bell, who is the actual founder or one of the founders of critical race theory, why do you believe he's being erased? And particularly Kimberly Crenshaw, who is, from my perspective, I don't see her as a racial justice as a race woman. I consider I'm a 21st century race woman, meaning I am Black first. I'm a Black woman, but I'm Black first. And I know that a lot of her politics is really around gender and intersectionality. And you just pointed out that the government, has not went after the gender warriors or intersectionalists the same way they have went after Black radicals.
Absolutely. I listen. That's not how I learned critical race theory with Kimberly being the founder of it. My understanding was that Kimberly was still in law school when they had the first conference at Wisconsin Madison. I know from reading the key book that she claims that her and others actually officially named it as critical race theory. But again, Derrick Bell's been working on that on the primary text that formed the idea and the movement of CRT back in the 70s. A lot of people try to start his legacy with Faces at the Bottom of the Well, but they forget that he was working under Robert L. Carter and looking at the Warren Court decisions on desegregation and writing articles about this in the 1970s. So it's interesting to me that that's a conversation. I mean, I've seen one or two clips, and like that's news to me. I've never seen any documentation that and even in her previous work, I've never seen her write down that she claims to be the founder. I've heard that she named it. I've heard that she came up with the name at the conference they had at Wisconsin Madison. But there were older scholars like Richard Delgado, Gene Stefanchik, that were there already doing the work as law professors, teaching this kind of generation of students. And Crenshaw's always positioned herself as a student of Derrick Bell. So that's a strange narrative to me. I think that in this era, though, that kind of revision is accepted, if not necessary, because Bell had a much more radical perspective. Bell was sensitive to women's rights issues. He turned down a job or tenure at Harvard to support a Black woman. But nonetheless, Derrick was very, very insistent on Black men's perspectives. His introduction to Baldwin's work, his use of Baldwin, his praise of Black militancy. These are not things that are popular under this current liberal / intersectional coalitional era. And I think that he's being displaced and erased. And I think that what this shows is that there's a serious worry on how easily knowledge and facts can be manipulated, right? The real issue here is that you have an intellectual genealogy of Black people and brown folk, right, that are starting critical race theory. Because I don't want to erase Richard Delgado. Delgado's a good personal friend. He's always been a mentor, and he was at the foundation of it as well. You have these people who have given their lives to the radicalization of how we understand social order and jurisprudence. And you fast forward right into the 21st century, and now we're trying to revise and rewrite the narrative, not because we have an intellectual, right? This is the important part, not because we have an intellectual interest in what critical race theory is or the roots of critical race theory, but because white people have now brought attention to the fact that they don't like critical race theory. And I think what ends up happening is, and I've said this on social media quite publicly, you have a lot of ambulance chasers. And what I mean by that is white people become upset about something, and then you have a whole bunch of Black people and brown folk rush to answer that call. Because in our social media age, the person that makes the most videos or gets the most likes now becomes the expert. I have no interest in that. I think I've given one or two commentaries on critical race theory because I've been researching this stuff for over 10 years, and I write articles about it, and I follow the genealogies of the traditions where they're borrowing from, the use of semicolonial analysis, and I publish my work. But that's very different than saying, oh, I know what critical race theory is because I read a few articles in grad school. So what you have is the lack of serious expertise really debating, right, the origins of critical race theory, the intellectual genealogy and foundations of it, and then the motivations behind it. Because the motivations behind critical race theory are not, let's just have another racial discourse. In fact, there's an article that Kimberly Crenshaw published where she said she was in law classes with Derrick Bell, learning about racism in the law, and took some classes or started reading Catherine McKinnon, and that's how she came up with the idea of intersectionality. So even the notion of intersectionality, by Crenshaw's own words, comes from a genealogy of critical race theory, and then this kind of radical feminist perspective that takes women as being the most essential and oppressed category. So to say that you founded something like that seems a little strange to me. But I also think that it plays into a different part, which is the de-radicalization of Black thought. Derrick Bell went on hunger strikes. Derrick Bell, passed up tenure. He refused to work or be vested in institutions that didn't have the interests of Black people and fairness at heart. He made those as personal choices. That's not the kinds of activists that we're dealing with today. We're dealing with people that want to be on MSNBC. And you and I've talked about this before. I've never had an interest in being on mainstream white television shows, despite probably having a larger audience, because they're not talking to Black people. They're not talking for Black people. And when your interest is reaching lots of white people, so that you now have a white audience and now new benefactors. What also happens with that is that you have to water down your message and not tell the truth. The reality of the situation is that critical race theory has become a talking point because white people see it's an issue. And rather than Black people ignoring or much less dismissing the ignorance of a white public that doesn't know what it's talking about, we have to now respond to white people who hold blogs as if they're serious intellectuals. Now, that's
Right.
not to say that we don't have a role in public intellectualism, but it is to say that I'm not going to hold or raise a white blogger to the status of a Black professor. It's
Right.
disrespectful. There's no other group of people that respond to social pressure or to white people's disdain the way that Black scholars do, as if all of
Wow.
our research is reactionary. We don't produce knowledge. We simply answer the anxiety and the trepidations of a white public. That's not the place, that's not the role that Black scholars should have in American society. And the debate's quite artificial because it's really an extension of the right trying to lump everything about race together in the critical race theory, because
Right.
critical race theory becomes this kind of radical, misnomer for anything having to do with Black people. What critical race theory specifically does is make an intervention in how we understand or what we took to be the progress of the civil rights movement and Brown v. Board of Education, and how that was supposed to lessen right Black oppression, but it ended up exacerbating the issues of white supremacy. In the very first articles that Derrick Bell's writing in the 1970s, like Racial Remediation, he published in the Notre Dame Lawyer, I think it's 77, 78. He actually makes the argument that, well, we've made certain assumptions that if we get rid of segregation, then we get equality. But he's like, what we've missed, of course, is there's white supremacy. And he's, of course, echoing what his mentor, Robert L. Carter, said a few years prior to that. That when we thought segregation was the issue, that if Black people had the same access to the economic, political, and social resources and capital that white people did, that inevitably racism will resolve itself. When we saw that that failed, right? And I think we have to admit, just concretely, as a matter of fact, that integration slash desegregation was overwhelmingly an empirical failure. Now we have to deal with the
Yes.
fact, right? We have to deal with the fact that white supremacy is still an engine that's producing social inequality, and that segregation was just one simple substantiation or instantiation of that of white supremacy's repertoire, so to speak, to oppress Black people. So Derrick Bell's being displaced because Derrick is coming from a very serious institutional and structural account of how racism operates. Whereas I think intersectionality and some of these other perspectives about race really do want coalitions, really do want white financiers, and appeals to white liberal and leftist politics in a way that Black radicalism simply can't do.
Woo. That last thing just prompted this question in my head, and I actually had another one primed for you, but I want to ask you this one first. Do you believe in this current moment, 2021, and as we continue to go beyond, do you believe that the seriousness of Derrick Bell and this idea of critical race theory, do you believe that we have taken, as a community, including Black scholars, do you believe we've taken a few steps backwards
Oh,
in
absolutely.
terms of our, yeah? Why
I
do
mean,
you
frankly,
think that is? White supremacy has, so this is my thought. I believe that
mhm,
white supremacy has also evolved as we have like went backwards, and I believe that it is very much more sophisticated than it's
mhm.
ever been in recent history. Would you agree with that?
I do, and I think that, listen, the reason that you had the alt right start at universities is
Mm-hmm.
because the alt right understood that in order to spread white supremacy or shift the cultural, um, the tilt the cultural perspective uh, towards their agenda, you had to de-radicalize the curricula, right, in the universities. because that's where people are learning these leftist ideas. Okay. The
Wow.
same thing happened to Black people.
Mm-hmm.
So what you end up doing is saying, well, look, if we're not teaching radical Black thought and we shift everything to coalitional logics, performativity, right? Phobia Rajas, writes a wonderful book about this, explaining how Ford Foundation and Carnegie don't support radical Black thinking that's looking at systematic or structural racism and inequality, but they prefer
Mm-hmm.
cultural perspectives that talk about resolution or performance, right? This it's not an accident that the kind of scholarship that's being lifted up is about performativity, is about individualism,
Mm-hmm.
is about identity, right? This is not what Derrick Bell's talking about. He rarely talks about identity, if at all, right? What he's talking about are the way that Black people as a group experience white supremacy in a racist society, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what ends up happening is you have Black people who are making it through the academy, but they're afraid of the consequences. And E. Franklin Frazier said this in The Failure of the Black Intellectual. He said,
Mm-hmm.
whereas African people are starting with what's the failure, impact, and consequences of being colonized by whites, Black people are asking, well, what are we being denied by discrimination? Now, notice those are
Mm-hmm.
two fundamentally different questions. If you're talking about what's been taken away from you by your oppressor, there's a certain resentment and antagonism you always have to your oppressor. If you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about we should be equal, but discrimination is preventing me from getting what white people have, then there's a certain way in which you're still aspiring to what white people actually possess, and then why you're prevented from accessing that too. So, in other words, you've
Mm-hmm.
defined equality not in your ability to self determine what you are, what your people are, what your group values and culture would be. You define equality comparatively based on what white people have and what you don't have that white people have. This is a really important point because our analysis of race and racism in the United States tend towards the perspective that we should have what white people have, but we don't. And that's the difference between a radical Black perspective that wants to fundamentally rupture the systems that produce inequality versus a kind of liberal tradition that's primarily focused on discrimination. And the academy tends to privilege scholars who focus more on discrimination, their experience, their positionality, rather than how people are systematically trying to transform institutions, society, and cultural worldviews.
Man, that's a lot. I think we posted the piece that you wrote on the 16th, but I just went back to that, and you you spoke about the gentrification of
Yes.
critical race theory, and that's it to me is so apropos. You say here, you said the readiness of white liberals to tout themselves and their scholarship as off-label uses of CRT methodology has institutionally solidified the markability of critical race theory / philosophies of race. So a spinoff of CRC that actually makes no mention of Derrick Bell's work, his
Mhm.
analysis, or the foundational economic critiques of the American neo-colonial apparatus. We haven't even touched on like the economics, and in that
Right.
particular sentence, I wanted you to kind of, I guess, dive a little bit deeper into like what that means.
Yeah. So I'll just be very straightforward. Eh,
Please.
White people have an overwhelming power to manipulate reality. So, in a field like philosophy, they developed a field called critical philosophies of race. For a long
Mm-hmm.
time, for a decade ago, when I was coming out of grad school, you had all these white scholars claiming we do critical race theory, and
Mm-hmm.
they got to say they do critical race theory because they're like, oh, we're doing psychoanalysis and we're reading white feminism and all this stuff into the question of race. And I said, I was this was when Derrick was still alive, and I
Mm-hmm.
remember I emailed him and I sent him an article and I was like, what do you think about this? And he
Mm-hmm.
literally told me, he's like, this is not critical race theory. This is not what I've envisioned. This is not my work. One of the reasons I had that email exchange with him that I've published, I think, in one or two articles about him not reading Marxism or Foucault is because he was like, look, I read Black authors and I never wanted the white stuff to mess up my style. Right. He's like, I have a style about how I see the world. And I mean, he was telling me this when I mean, God, I was 23, 24, right? I was right into my PhD program. And I had so much respect for his perspective precisely because, he was showing me that there was a certain kind of work and paradigm that he was doing that these other scholars didn't do. But here's what
Right.
white people did. Now, that's an important historical point because here's what white scholars did. White scholars decided they didn't want to read Derrick Bell or Richard Delgado or Kenneth Nunn or Linda Green. right? They decided we're not going to do any of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a field and hire people in jobs that don't have to know any of these people. So
Damn.
because white people decided, and this is what I mean when I say we have to understand the nuance and the operation of white supremacy and the power of white consensus. White people in the academy just decided that we're going to call critical race theory psychoanalysis, feminism, liberal theory that talks about why racism exists. They just decided that's what we're going to do. They didn't have to answer to anybody for erasing foundational texts, for not knowing the key book of critical race theory, for not knowing or engaging the works of Delgado or Stefanczyk. No consequence to it. 10 or 15 years ago, in my discipline of philosophy, people were actually hired for jobs in critical race theory that never read Derrick Bell. Never had to. You don't have to. You can get a job in the academy because white people are deciding who gets hired and who doesn't get hired. So the people who admittedly are doing a hire in this because they don't know what they're talking about decide who gets hired in it. So because they feel more comfortable with a certain kind of conversation, they get to decide what's the best candidate, even though they admittedly these institutions don't know anything about what they're hiring in. And that's why you get this kind of de-radicalized thought where people will say, well, critical race theory is intersectionality. Well, yeah, intersectionality has is an outgrowth, right? I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw's first article out of law school was really a critical race theory argument because it was about law and reentrenchment, right? Like how the law operates to constantly reproduce racial inequality. That article, Pell, is never cited as much as mapping the margins. Right. So I think what she's gotten credit for and what she's become an intellectual leader for is what became more popular in the circles around feminism, not around this more systematic argument about racial oppression. Like we can say it, but we don't study it systemically. And this is what Derrick Bell was doing, because Derrick Bell was using semicolonial analysis, not Marxism. And people, I keep seeing people on social
media. Can you
media,
explain the difference of semicolonial? Yeah.
Absolutely. So semicolonial analysis is basically making the argument that Black people in the United States are ruled as if they're a colony. So they're so we talk about Delaney's a nation within a nation. Basically, Black people are a colony within an empire. So you run Black people, especially in the South back in the day, like colonies. You exploit their labor, you take away their rights. They have no value as human beings. They're subjects within a government, right, or within a geopolitical space. That's different than a Marxist analysis, which is saying that Black people are part of a proletariat, right, or part of a class that's debating or are interacting with rich classes. Because remember, in Bell's analysis, poor white people are still a powerful class to determine Black rights. And this is what I'm saying. People have really not seriously read Bell. Bell's argument is that Black rights are the product of negotiations between upper class or elite whites and poor whites. And that in the negotiation between these two white classes, Black people's rights get traded, right, are negotiated for certain outcomes amongst the white population. So the reason that if Black people get a civil right, like, desegregation, and it starts disadvantaging poor whites create, social protests that influence elites to readjust and decrease the rights of Black people. So he talks about all this in racial remediation and silent covenants, etc. Right? So it's not a straight up Marxist analysis because he's problematizing the way that poor whites operate within systems of racial exchange. Now, if you take that into, he's just talking about Marxism, then you're missing that he's like, regardless of the class position that Black people are in, right? You can see this in space traders. Regardless of the class position that Black people are in, white people can decide to trade you to aliens. Damn. And it's such a power. And this is what people talk about it because they like the provocativeness of space traders. But like when I was writing my dissertation, I actually spoke to Derrick about it. The impact of space traders is it shows that we're always in a precarious position. That our race, that our Blackness is what creates the kind of vulnerability and fungibility of our position in a nation. That, think about it, if white people decided, this is what I mean by the power of white consensus. If white people decided to get rid of Black people, they would get rid of Black people. Yeah. And at the bottom of it, we know that. If the government decided that we have an incentive to get rid of all Black people will run to their white allies. And they will run to their white allies because they know that Black people don't have the power to self-determine and fight against a government, a state, and a white population. So imagine claiming that we're equal or that equality is on the horizon when you live with the very idea that white people decide if you live or die. White people decide if you have access to institutions. White people decide if you could get married. White people decide if you could still vote, right? These are the things. Under Trump, Black people were real nervous. They weren't nervous because of Trump. They were nervous because they realized that one person in the executive, despite the judicial and despite Congress, can decide to take away Black people's rights. Trump demonstrated that overwhelmingly clear. But we have no answer to that. And notice how the conversation shifted. And this is what I mean about the conversation being reactionary. We're not talking about the fact that Trump exposed the fact that Black rights are contingent upon white people's perceptions of reality or their discomfort with Black people actually becoming, living their lives as minorities. We got Trump out of office and everybody got back on page. All the Black academics are back on page. Let's start reacting to the crazy white conservative. But the crazy white conservative, while they're the targets of Trump's platform, what about these white liberals?
Come on.
What about these white liberals that are allegedly the majority of the electorate that allowed Trump not only to get into power, but to exercise power over and over again against Black people, brown folk, and Muslims? See, so what does that tell you? That tells you that the power that's held within the country is still white power. And this is ultimately what Derrick Bell sought to expose, that you can play this game as if the amount of money you have, or that you teach at an Ivy League institution, or that you run a multi-million-dollar corporation means something. But if white people decide to take that away, they take it away. And that's why racism is permanent. Because no matter the amount of benefits or resources you accumulate that makes you think you have equality, individually or as a group, is contingent on white people's consensus and agreement with that possession that you have. And now that is something that we don't want Black people to seriously think about. Because every time you have that conversation about how white people decide and define reality by what they agree upon, and that Trump shows that even if it's a small majority of white people that agree with that kind of position on Black people, the whole world changes. Could you imagine what would happen if Trump won a second term? Could you imagine what would happen to voting rights, civil rights, the remnants of affirmative action that we have now, the amount of the legitimacy of white vigilantism that we would have in a pandemic, right? Could you imagine what that would have looked like? And the only thing that Black people did was we threw up a prayer and said, "Oh God, please let us not get Trump again." And we took Biden, who's done nothing. Biden's only success is that he's not Trump. Biden's contribution to Black people is he's not Trump. And then we don't analyze that moment. We don't analyze not only the majority of white people that voted for Trump, who holds real power.
And the majority of white people still voted for Trump this time.
He did, exactly. We're not analyzing the power of the executive. Remember when Obama was in office, Obama couldn't do anything. He was everybody's president. If he's only the president, he has to work with Congress. Trump signed God knows how many executive orders, just surpassing everybody. He set into place, look at it. He set into place a Supreme Court that's going to last for the next several decades that are going to be fundamentally antagonistic to any kind of social progress on Black people's rights, racial rights, civil rights, and specifically Black rights. And we're not talking about that. And this is what I mean when I say that we've developed a kind of scholarship and we develop an intellectual tradition that chases the ambulances that white people decide. White people decide our intellectual agendas. We're not talking about the kinds of vulnerabilities that are being exposed in real time based on what we see happening in the real world to Black and brown folk, right? And we're satisfied with that because we rather talk about how we could all get along, how we should form intersectional coalitions, how all these multiple oppressions exist. And that's fine to have that as a conversation, but that's not where the power is. The power isn't because you haven't acknowledged somebody's oppression or experiences. The power is that white people get to decide whether or not you get to vote or not vote. The power is that you get to decide whether or not you get driver's licenses so you can register as a voter in a state, right? These are the kinds of issues that Black people still have to deal with that don't get any attention because we're too worried about identity and infighting amongst ourselves about who's the most oppressed. So when we ask the question of whether or not we've lost our way, whether or not we've become more de-radicalized compared to the era of scholars that are being produced by Derrick Bell, the answer is overwhelmingly yes. Because we're not concerned with actual social inequality. We're concerned with who gets recognized as the most oppressed by the white liberals, who then agree to warrant or reward those people with jobs, opportunities, and financial stability over other groups of Black people.
And I shit, that you said a lot, and I see it every day, particularly in the so-called social justice space, organizing, activism, particularly on the white left, so-called leftist or liberal side. Black people, I will submit to you that Black people were fucked whether Trump or Biden won. We really just were, because and my worry is what we're seeing now. You have Biden basically proposing a crime bill too, giving more funding to the police to the chagrin of many poor and working class Black folks throughout this country. This country has continued to show us that they would rather kill and incarcerate us versus invest in holistic things that we know would end all of the crime and things, intra-community violence and all of those things that's happening in the community. So really, what I've seen is a lot of silence, even from advocacy groups that work on criminal justice reform, is because a lot of times their funding and their money could potentially get cut off if they go after a Democrat or go after the president. As hard as folks really need to be going at this president, you really see. I haven't seen a lot in terms of advocacy outside of the voting rights, but when it comes to jobs, we're in trouble. When it comes to criminal justice, we are in trouble, Tommy. I don't know how things look in Edinburgh, but Black folks are in trouble here. I mean, I know you know that.
I mean, there's not a lot of Black folks in Edinburgh, but but again, they've eliminated the race problem. They've made sure Black people don't get here. No, but I mean, seriously, I mean, I think that's one of the differences between the UK and the United States, right? Is that the UK gets to claim that it doesn't have a race problem, so the conservatism just becomes offensive opinions that everybody has. But they have a managerial and immigration policy that doesn't let high levels of Black people into the country, right? And if you do
in Edinburgh,
country, well, yeah, in the UK generally, in Great Britain,
in the UK generally, wow,
yeah. So their claim to not have a race problem is really that we've solved the race problem. It's like, the thing about America that we have to remember is that America thought the race problem would be the doom of civilization. They didn't think the gender problem would. They thought the race problem would. Right?
That's right.
And I love how people rewrite history, right? Because people say, oh, well, sexism against women, X, Y, and Z. Women were not traded as slaves. There was no market to trade women unless they were part of a racial group. No other group of men got to oppress white women besides white men, right? And that's a very important point. If you think about how
say that again.
No other group of men got to oppress white women besides white men. And the reason for that is because white people were the rulers of every other group of people all over the world. If you weren't of the right European stock, right, usually Anglo-Saxon or Teutonic, you weren't oppressing anybody, right? Because these groups, at least at the turn of the 20th century, they were vying for control of the world. Right. This is why the book I did on Josiah Royce was so important. It wasn't because I was that interested in Josiah Royce. It's because these people are having debates about who gets to decide and rule Black folk across the world, brown folk across the world, indigenous people across the world. Right. So when we start looking about that into that and start thinking seriously about that, then we have to ask ourselves, well, then what is it about Black people always being managed but never being in control? Trump demonstrated that Black people are a population that's still managed. We have Black people that have white friends that protect us, right? That we vote overwhelmingly Democratic because at least they're not going to take away our rights. Now, that may not do anything for us, right? But at least they won't oppress us the way that the Republicans will. This is our decision making.
Oh, but they do.
Oh, they do. They do. But this is what we teach Black people. Right? That you don't vote Republican because those people are racist and are going to oppress you. They want to get you back to slavery. But these liberal Democrats, well, they at least care about you. They may not help us, but they care about it. Like this is all fiction. This is all
very much fiction,
right? Because it's about who gets to decide and control Black people. And the minute that a black person starts asking these very serious questions, why is it that in the 21st century, we're still a population that's controlled and managed? Well, that person's a radical, or that person's misogynistic, or that person's a nationalist, right? Same thing with BLM. We're having a conversation about critical race theory, but we're not having a conversation about how a group of elite women under an intersectional banner have exploited the lives and the positions of poor black people to
and dead black men
and dead black men to become millionaires. Now, all the black people out of the civil rights movement were executed or killed. Like, think about this seriously. King killed, X killed. Robert F. Williams was in exile. Think about all the people that were in exile, persecuted, targeted by the government, put in jail. These people allegedly are the second civil rights movement. They become millionaires. And nobody even asks, well, where's your accountability to black folk? Where's your accountability to the people who have died? What are you doing for these young black men that see themselves murdered by hundreds in the streets every year? Do you care about those people? You see, this is what I mean. We're not allowed to ask these questions because we're told in the academy, right? I'm sure I've been canceled more times than I could know, right? But they tell us in the academy, well, if you say these things, you'll never get a job, right? That the people that we entrust with the education of our own people, because that's ultimately what we think black professors' obligations are, to educate our own people. The very people that we trust, the black community trusts to educate our own people, are being told that if you ask certain questions against what white liberals have defined as the black agenda, that you will be banned, you will be canceled, you won't have any kind of academic career. I've had people tell me when they've attacked black men, I say, look, why are you going in on black men? Like, what is, I'm missing the point, right? I know the data. Here's the data. What's the point? Where they're like, we can't attack black women and we can't attack feminists and we can't attack white supremacy. So this is the accepted target of criticism. And I was like, wow, imagine all the problems that we have in our communities, right? With childcare, with child abuse, right? With unemployment. We can't talk about any of those things. Right. But you can talk about how black men basically aren't shit, how they're dangerous, pathological, etc. All the time you got a white man in the White House that was president. America voted for a white man that was president that was a misogynist, a sexual harasser, a rapist, etc. Put in Supreme Court justices that have histories or accusations of rape and sexual assault. But you worried about Jerome, who may or may not be doing something that's now serving multiple sentences in jail. Right
now, that's a good point.
The target of our intellectual activism are so misplaced.
It is misplaced, and I can't help but believe that is certainly by design. But one of the things that you just said, particularly about Trump and his appointment of Supreme Court justices, and we know Kavanaugh was accused of all kinds of sexual impropriety, assault, and all of this stuff. And around that same time, ironically, the trend, or whatever you call it on Twitter, where something goes viral, there was a hashtag that said black men are trash. I have still to this day, Tommy, have never seen white women start a hashtag that said white men are trash after Kavanaugh, after Trump, after literally we could go on for hours naming the list of white men who have abused and exploited all of the, and to me, I feel like, Doc, somebody said Doc going in. And so to me, that is very telling of where some of our people are. I refuse to believe that all black people, but where some of our people are, particularly the so-called educated in the academy and people who have close proximity to whiteness and particularly white liberals and access to funding from white folks, that's where the mindset is. It's almost like, from my observation, that it pays. It literally pays to dehumanize black men and boys.
Absolutely it does. One of the biggest, I'll tell you this from my experience, like one of the biggest determinants of social mobility in liberal arts fields, right? I don't know so much of the hard sciences, but in liberal arts fields, the biggest predictor of whether or not you mobilize when you do studies of race and gender is whether or not you hold negative opinions about black men. There's not a single scholar that I could think of that writes positively about black men in the liberal arts that's in a high position, a research one or Ivy League position. Not a single one. Now, they may say positive things in social media. They may say things, in conversation, but I don't know of any systematic scholarship that defends Black men as progressive, as caring, as vulnerable, etc. That's written by somebody in liberal arts. Now, you find epidemiologists, sociologists, people in education, right? You find those scholars there, but you're not going to find them in liberal arts because overwhelmingly liberal arts disciplines define themselves by the pathologization of Black men. And I think that's a really important point. When
How
you when
the
you
fuck
look,
is that allowed? Like
because
how?
white people decide who's hired. A dean will give you a line. That's what I'm saying. Departments are like mini kingdoms. They're like mini fiefdoms, right? If the dean is not going to intervene in a department's hire of a person, so if everybody in the department is like a white feminist or a white liberal, and they believe that men have privilege and power, and they believe that they're racist, they believe Black men are dangerous, of course they're open to these ideas. I see this is the problem. The idea that Black men are dangerous and rapists and misogynists, etc., appeals to the most base sensibilities that white people have had about Black people who are not Black people and other non-white men since the 1800s. Like this is literally why they colonized people. We need to go save the women. The women are bare breasted. The women are living in shacks. They're not treated and valued as women. Let's go kill all the men. Let's make them our concubines. Like this is how white people thought, right? So this idea of women's rights or gender that we keep inventing is always a positive thing is just not that. That's not to say that women should not have rights. I'm not saying anything crazy like that, even though liberals love to accuse me of that, right? Oh, somehow you're against women's rights. That's not the issue. But the issue is just like everything else, capitalism, civil rights, etc., as an insidious racist history. And the insidious racist history is when you have people that already believe that non-white men are dangerous, be they Muslim, Arab, Black, Mexican, etc., you're going to enforce that racism through your gender politic, which is why you have programs that will not hire racialized men unless they prove to them that somehow they're safe. And this is an overwhelming problem in the academy, right? Black and brown men are two of the least represented groups in the academy generally. So there's an overwhelming fear that people have of these groups, of the men of these groups. So no dean's going to check your hiring committee if your faculty says we vote for X person because they're the best, and that's why you have the kinds of stuff coming out in the academy that you have. And the thing in liberal arts is liberal arts don't even require evidence. Like liberal arts is all about interpretation and theory. So you can make something up, people believe it. It's the brand new theory. It could be empirically false, which is what my work demonstrates. Oh, I'm a bad person because I depend on white empiricism. So I have arguments with other Black scholars that will make claims about Black men are X, Y, and Z. I will go refute it based on the data or criminological studies or a CDC data set. How do you answer this? Oh, well, you're using empiricism. Empiricism is white supremacy. But I was like, but you're using Freud.
But your theory ain't white supremacy.
You're using subculture violence theory. Like all this is white supremacy if you're getting down to it. But you have no problem doing that to demonize a certain segment of Black people. And I can't overstress that enough. The reward of Black scholarship around issues of race, right, has always been who demonizes a certain segment of the Black population. So
that's almost a requirement.
It's a requirement. Seems. Right. Like I don't view, and see, this is why it's so funny when you think about the kinds of arguments that people make against me. I don't pathologize any Black people because I don't think Black people are pathological. I don't think that the high rates of child abuse amongst Black women in our communities caused because of Black women. I think it's caused because of poverty, because of isolation, because of trauma. I don't think Black people or Black men that abuse their children are Black women do it because they're bad people or because they're men. I think it's because they're poor, unemployed, suffer recidivism trauma, right? I believe in that there are social determinants that influence behavior. Right. So there's nothing wrong with us because the populations, the demographics that this happened with are some of the most economically and politically deprived populations of our race in the United States. So when you ask that question, well, what's wrong with Black people? It's our condition. You can't put it's the crab in the barrel thing. People's like, oh, they'll pull each other down. The crab's natural environment is not the barrel.
That's right.
You put them there. And then you look at the behavior that they demonstrate in the barrel as if that's their natural state.
That's a perfect analogy.
No other group of people, no other group of people. You don't look at people that suffer genocides, like in Armenia or the Holocaust, and say that what these people did in those environments are their natural personality. You
Right.
don't say that women who were bartering sex to stay alive, or men who were abusing women, or women who were having sex with Jewish boys on the runaway, that's their natural environment. You
Right.
understand that their people are dejected, they're oppressed, they're facing death, they're trying to escape in any way possible. And then sometimes that leads to violence and abuse of other people. But you will have Black scholars in the United States take as a position of their scholarship and their intellectual foundation that something's wrong with a certain member of their community. They don't say
Wow.
anything about white people, right? You're not saying anything about white people creating the kinds of structures, right, that have a literal hand. Like, you can materially see how white people and white policy have taken Black people, Black men out of households and communities. You don't talk about that, but you got to talk about these scary Black men who are psychoanalytically geared to think that they have the permission to commit violence. And then the evidence for that isn't any studies about Black men. It's just, well, Bell Hooks said it, right? So we have a real problem, right? Derrick Bell was a lawyer. He was a law scholar. He worked on desegregation cases. He represented poor Black people and their interests. So his
Right.
scholarship looks like he's representing and talking about from the perspective of Black people. The scholars that
Yes.
we're talking about today don't advocate for anybody. I advocate for Black people, Black men and boys who are victims of trauma. I work
Right.
with this population. So my work reads as if I have a vested interest in decreasing violence in our communities. I went and got a public health degree because I am interested in decreasing violence in our communities. If you got a degree in English and you just feel like you want to blow up on social media, you don't have an investment that's materially invested or tied to the well-being of your community. And that's the problem. It's the disassociation that white liberals see as an opportunity to incentivize versus divest in Black scholars in the academy.
Or to leverage Black people and Blackness to some extent, um, to further their own
Oh,
agendas
absolutely.
around gender.
Yeah.
And some people even argue the LGBTQ plus industrial complex as well, where you will leverage, Black folks. It seems to me, Black women in particular,
Mhm.
to push or further their own sort of interest around that.
Yeah.
And Dr. Curry, this is a good time for us because I can't let you go without segue and talking about your experience in the American Academy,
Mhm.
right? You and Dr. Gwinnett Curry, Dr. Gwinnett is Dr. Tommy's wife. Y'all are like family, y'all
Mhm.
family to us. And I remember when you were under vicious attack,
Mhm.
when you were still in Texas, for being who you are, being the amazing scholar, and for centering Black folks and Black boys and men in particular,
Mhm.
and talking about, I believe it was a video that you did with Rob Reddy. I still go back and listen to
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
videos. I love those videos. And you were talking about the brother out of North Carolina, Robert F. Williams,
Yeah.
and this idea of defending ourselves, our right to defend ourselves. And there were some white supremacists, right-wing white supremacists, that got a hold of one of those videos, completely took it out of context, and that seemed to start the ball rolling, with how more people got to know who you are, but it also put your family, yourself and your
Mhm.
family at jeopardy. Can you share a little bit of a synopsis of that time and how the lack of the support that you got from the president of the university at that time?
Oh, well, it's funny because when I was little, my dad used to tell me this story about how when white people weren't happy with Black people, or if white people wanted something Black people had, they would come to
Mm,
their house with guns and take it, right?
damn.
Um, so my experience with guns was really about protecting what Black people had, and I
Right.
and I and I thought about that because when that incident at Texas A&M happened, I thought, wow, this is. I mean, at the time I was like 36, 37. Almost 40 years later, Black people have to have the same fear that if you say something that white people don't like, they can take your career, they can take your life, and you will have other white people who are allegedly are liberals sit by and co-sign on it, right?
Yep.
Um, and I'll be very honest. Like, I had overwhelming support from Black scholars, but there were a lot of Black scholars who didn't want to support me because they thought that my focus on Black men and the criticisms I've made about intersectionality or Black feminism didn't warrant me being supported. And again, that's the irony to me, that we
Mm-hmm.
can have my disagreements with intersectionality, Black feminism, etc., are not ideological; they're material. How do you account for this other kind of violence? You
That's
say that
right.
domestic abuse happens primarily to women. The data suggests otherwise. How do you account for it? How do we explain it? These are intellectual interests. I don't have a political stake in Black women not getting resources, or Black children or Black community not getting resources. At certain levels, a practical thing. If intersectionality actually worked and Black people's lives would be improved, despite me voicing my agreement or disagreement, I would support it because it's improving Black people's lives. But that's not what's happening. So the issue at Texas A&M was about the fact that I stated very plainly, and I'll state it again: Black people should not be slaughtered as animals and dogs in America. Black
Right.
people have a right to life and liberty the same way that every American does, every American citizen does. And if white people feel that they have the God-given right to destroy, kill, maim, exploit, and abuse, right, terrorize Black people, then Black people have a Second Amendment right to defend themselves.
Right.
That's what I said. I concretely stand by that position. Now, that's not me saying that Black people should pick up guns and go kill white people, but that is me saying that if white people
We
come
should
to Black
defend
communities,
ourselves.
we should
Right.
defend ourselves. And I wholeheartedly stand by that comment. Now, what happened at Texas A&M was that about, I think I mentioned this previously, about a week or two before, I had sent a document outlining systemic discrimination and racism
Mm-hmm.
at the university to the dean of faculties.
Mm-hmm.
A week later, not even a week later, I then get these emails suggesting that somehow this old video had resurfaced. I don't think those two things are unconnected, are disconnected. But what ended up happening was that you had the president of the university say that he thought my language was threatening, that it didn't represent core values, the typical white apologetic speech.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but and as I told people then, nothing I said is outside of my research trajectory. It's not a controversial statement. It's not a slip of the tongue. And I think that the fact that so many white people were invested um, in the idea that Black people should not have a Second Amendment right of self-defense tells you what the political orientation of people are.
Mm-hmm.
What that moment taught me was that as much as we celebrate Black achievement and Black success, we try to pigeonhole any Black person, especially Black men, right, that have a real disagreement with white liberal ideology or integrationism, etc., as radicals and illegitimate. So what ended up happening is that you had a whole bunch of white people, white scholars, white professors at university, suggest that despite being one of the most prolific Black theorists I certainly think of my generation, that none of my scholarship mattered. The fact that I had just gotten promoted to full professor in 6 years, that didn't matter, right? The fact that they elevated this white racist blogger, Rod Dreher, uh, to a conversation based on a blog, a complete misreading of an academic article. But he gets elevated as if he's a professional and a colleague, right?
Right.
These are all products and symptoms of the kinds of racism and dehumanization that Black people deal with in U.S. academies. Uh,
Right.
the only difference is that, unlike many other people, I didn't apologize because
Right.
at the foundation, I don't think I did anything wrong. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that when we have that kind of position, this is what I meant about white consensus and white people deciding everything. If you have a position where white people get to tell you what you wrote means, I'm the author, and they get to tell me what it means and why they're offended by it and why that should determine my job. Black people's security, Black people's professionalism, Black people's economic, careers and livelihoods are not protected. And
Right.
that's a position that I adamantly refuse. I refuse to put myself in a position where I have to respect the opinion that white people have about me, myself, and other Black folk more than what I think about that. And
Right.
and I think that, and I'll be honest with you, I had the dean of the university, or the college, actually expressed to me that she's like, Tommy, one of the problems that people have with you is you think too highly of yourself,
So
right?
that's the uppity
So
Negro.
that's
You
the
the
uppity
uppity.
Negro, right? Like
Wow.
niggas stay in your place kind of syndrome. And so the
Wow.
culture, but this is Southern culture, right? Like this is the difference.
Shit,
I
that's
would
American culture, but I
that
feel you.
that yeah, but see, that is American culture. But see, in the South, white people have no problem telling a Black person this to their face.
It's
And
true. Being from Alabama or growing
yeah,
up in
yeah,
Alabama,
you
it's
know,
absolutely true.
I say, I listen. I tell people all the time. White people, my wife and I laugh about this all the time. White people are one emotion away from calling a Black person a nigger any day of the week. They're one
Mm-hmm.
emotion away from doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
that tells you something about the reality of what's happening in the academy. So
Mm.
many young Black men specifically, and I know sisters go through it too. So don't my comment is not meant to ignore, right, the kind of stresses that Black women go through in the academy. But I got this. I've had so many young Black men tell me that they don't say anything because they want to have a job. They don't say unpopular opinions because they're afraid they won't have a job. Now think about that. This is the academy. Imagine living your whole life trying to say and write things and publish so that no one can disagree with you, so that everyone sees you as safe, right? And this is one of the major, me and a really old I call him old now, but he is old. Yeah, I think he'll accept that. But one of my mentors, when I was first coming out, there was a white woman that attacked me at a conference. And I didn't yell. I was very, I'm always professional. I'm always polite. I think I'm quite charming. But I lit her ass up. I embarrassed her because the point wasn't that I had to yell or anything. I was like, you just don't know anything. And after it, he fussed at me, or he discussed me. He's like, well, you can't do that to white people. You especially can't do that to a white woman in your field. I was like, but she did X, Y, and Z. She's yelling, she's turning red, she's shaking, she's telling me she's gonna refute everything I think, and I'll never get a job, X, Y, and Z. He's like, well, this is just the way things are.
She said all that?
Oh, she said all that. She said all that. And I told him, I was like, I understand the consequences. And I had to tell her, I was like, I respect what you're saying. I appreciate what you're telling me. But I refuse to bend for white people. I refuse to put myself in a position. Like, I'm from Louisiana, right? And I mean, even being back in Lake Charles has brought back some memories of this. I refuse to put myself in a position where white people get to decide my worth and then how I should behave. I will never put myself in a position where white people, despite what I know, get to tell me what I should not say and who I have to answer to. And that's something in the academy that we don't want to have an honest conversation about. It's not about conversations dealing with race and racism. That's not the issue. The issue is white people control our behavior, our discourse, and our topics of interest precisely because they decide whether or not we actually get to be there. One of the things that white people in the field, and I'm pretty sure in general, are so upset about is that Black people like me should have never got through. Right?
That's exactly what they're upset about.
That's why they mad.
You should have never got through. Like, how did we miss him?
How did this happen?
Yeah.
Right? How does a Black person that thinks what he thinks get out, then gets a research position and produce grad students, and now is at an elite institution? This should not have happened. We create systems so that Black boys from the South don't think that they could be professors.
That's right.
The first generation working class Black men don't fundamentally believe, right, that this is something that they can do.
Right.
And I think that until we become honest with the fact that the academy is structured in that way, right, then we're not going to actually be able to have fundamental conversations about how Black people can change it.
Right. The phone is ringing. That's fine. This is the last question because I know you're home with family. And I'm so glad that y'all are back, and I'm sure your parents and all your family are just glad to have you all there. Last question before I let you go, and I definitely got to bring you back, brother, because I want to talk more about this end of it. But you. And I don't know if you would describe it this way. I'm your sister, so completely push back on me if you wouldn't describe it. But do you feel, based on everything that we've talked about here, based on your position that you just said, you're not going to allow white people to define you or to basically push you in the corner to be something that you're not? And I actually raised my children that way. But you are actually in the UK now, right? You're not in the American academia system anymore. And I know that you had applied for several different positions and all of that stuff, but you would not have been able to be in the same position that you are now. You are actually the chair, and you have a lot of power over the kind of scholarship that you do, and you are in a position to really build out Black male studies, which I, for one, as a Black woman married to a Black man, and I have a Black son, I'm excited about. It's past due, and I'm glad that you are the one who are at the helm. But would it be accurate to say that you were run out of the country to actually be able to do something like that?
It's funny because I see that a lot on social media, and I try to correct it when I see it, right?
Sure, yeah.
Look, I mean, my experiences, I think, were like anybody doing radical scholarship. There's some jobs that I applied for where I didn't get a foot in the door. There were some jobs I applied for where it was very clear that people were not supportive of Black male studies or my perspective, and I didn't get those jobs. And there were other jobs that I were invited to apply for that I didn't get because I lost out to a better candidate. Right. Um, I think that, and I've seen this used both ways. I certainly wasn't run out the country, right? That is inaccurate. I could have stayed. I could have just stayed at Texas A&M, or took a position. I had, I think, 8 on campus interviews the year I left. So I could have did that. The issue wasn't that I was every year I would get job interviews, 3 to 5 job interviews. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that sometimes it wasn't the right fit, and sometimes there were just more qualified people, right? Like there was a directorship that I applied for at a think tank, and the person they picked was much older than me. You got to remember, at the time I was applying for chair positions at major research institutions, and really high ranked top 20 institutions at 35 and 36, and so it was precocious in a certain way, but I understand how my age and relative precociousness and inexperience could look to a committee. So that's fine. Other jobs, people have just flat out said, we don't like that you're taking up for Black men. We do feminism or intersectionality. We're not interested, right? And other places, it was just like, look, it wasn't the right fit. I took the job in the UK because when I interviewed here, there was an excitement about bringing this perspective. And to be quite honest with you, I was tired of the identity politics in the United States. That doesn't exist in the UK in the same way. It has a whole set of other
Wow.
problems of racism, but it doesn't exist the same way in the United States. One of my graduate students just took a job at Queen's University in Black male studies. So you have Black male studies scholars that are using the man, not using this paradigm that's extending it. Mike Sawyer at Pitt, just wrote the book of Malcolm X. You of course have William A. Smith. He just got a distinguished professorship at the University of Utah. It's one of those things where, yeah, I think that I'm certainly one of the most visible and vocal young scholars that's kind of pushing Black male studies and this kind of radical idea to the fore. But the people that we have doing this kind of work in the United States are extremely reputable and just high prestige institutions, are hold distinguished titles themselves. I think what's really an issue in the United States is and I've said this to people before, the invention of failure, right? So there's some people who don't know any better, where they're like, look, they pushed him out, this is a tragedy, etc. There are other people who try to flip this conversation like, well, he wasn't good enough to get a job in the United States, so he went to the UK. And for those people, I really don't understand it, because if I have a full professorship and I've held an endowed position even at Texas A&M because I was a Rothbard fellow, I don't have to leave. I'm full. Nobody fired me. Now, did I like the climate there? Absolutely not. Right. But I wanted to experience something different. And I thought, hey, there's never been a Black person to hold a chair position in the UK. Let me apply for this job. I applied for it.
You made history? I'm
yeah,
not surprised, but wow. Yeah. Well, I didn't know that part.
Yeah. Like, this is the birthplace of the Enlightenment. David Hume, right, he wasn't on faculty, but he lectured here. And there's never been a Black person since the 1500s, 1581, that's ever held a professorial chair at the University of Edinburgh in the philosophy department. I'm the very first Black person in history to ever do that. I'm the first Black person in history to ever get full at Texas A&M. Right, I was the first Black person in history to hold to win a national debate tournament, in CETA. I won JV nationals a long time ago. Like, there's still all these firsts, and that's not so much to do with me. I'm just happy to be at the right place at the right time. But there's still all these firsts that Black people have to accomplish because of how racist the system is, right? So the narrative, right, that somehow this is a failure, or that I accepted a professorial chair at one of the, I think Edinburgh's like top 15 or 15th best university in the world. Somehow that's a failure. It's just nonsense. But it speaks to the way that we think about things. If I would have accepted a job at Cambridge or Oxford or LS or London School of Economics or University of London, are those failures as well? Nobody thinks that. People are excited about getting jobs at these, prestigious ancient universities. But what we have in the United States is this need to somehow say that people who fundamentally disagree with us have to be, somehow, I guess, put in line or lessened, etc. That's not the case. This was an opportunity. I'm excited about the work that I do here in the UK. There are other universities in the United States that have certainly asked me to come back, and that's something that, my wife and I are thinking about. But it's about, the reality of the situation for me is that it's about the work and my ability to do the work. I care
Yes.
deeply about Black people. I care deeply about Black families. I think
Me
the
too.
work that my wife and I do shows that we care deeply about Black women and girls. And
Yes.
because of Black male studies, both my wife and I agree that we have to care and do a better job theorizing and interpreting Black men and boys. This is a communal effort, right? And I think that what you have are a group of self serving intellectuals, be they Black or white, that want to demonize Black male studies because they don't want Black men to have any semblance of a humanity that the world has to respect. This is not some decadent nationalist politics. This is asking, why do we not study Black men as they actually are in the world, and instead of, through the veins of bell hooks, who wants to suggest that they're poor beasts who rape women to fulfill suicidal desire. Like this stuff, you can't even make this stuff up. Right? You can't even make
Wow.
this stuff up, just how badly Black men are represented in some Black feminist literature. And that's not me saying that all Black feminists believe that. That's not me saying all Black women believe that. But we
Sure.
have certain kinds of problems that are ideologically situated and invested upon by white people and white academies and departments that make it very, very easy to demonize Black men and boys for all the nation's problems. And these people profit off of that. We saw that around Trump and the allegedly 20%, over 20% of Black men were going to vote for Trump, right? Right. That's what we were told because of toxic masculinity. That wasn't true, right?
Right.
Black men were said to be the largest killers of Black women a decade ago. That wasn't true. But this is
Right.
what's being pushed on these Black feminist blogs, social media, and their public commentaries. Black male studies just wants to hold those people accountable. You're not saying things that we can verify as being true. If you're saying falsehoods, you need to be held accountable for falsehoods. And we're very much into understanding the position that the Black community has in the United States, why we're vulnerable, why we're killed, why we're
Yeah.
neglected and marginalized, why we have deleterious health consequences for things that other populations rebound from very quickly. Why are we not talking about the fact that Black men were killed, had the most disproportionate mortality rate from COVID-19?
I
We don't.
saw that. Yeah.
We keep saying Black women are disproportionately affected. Yes, Black women are disproportionately affected compared to everyone else. But compared to
Hmm.
Black men, they're less disproportionately affected. Why are
Hmm.
Black men taking the brunt of that? That's not a competition. There's not a competition between who dies more. It's a question of if Black men are dying more, why are Black men dying more? That's the intellectual question.
And what
We
is
need
the political reason for invisibilizing Black men and boys?
exactly, exactly. Like, is it that we really feel that their death should matter? We hide the fact 200 over 220 Black men are shot every year by police in this country. Right, roughly 5 to 10 Black women are killed, usually in association with a Black man. Now, is that me erasing Black women? Absolutely not, because I put it up on a chart. Here's how many Black women were killed. Here's how many Black men were killed. Nobody's erasing anybody. But I
Right.
want to ask the intellectual question. Why are 200 Black men dying a year because they're being shot by cops? Why
Right.
are almost a million Black men in jail? These are questions that we need to research because they go at the foundation of what's wrong with our communities. That
Right.
doesn't mean that other members of our community don't experience violence. That
Right.
doesn't mean that other members of our communities are not brutalized. It just means that you have this huge disproportionate effect. I want to know why that disproportionality exists.
That's
And
right.
people are funding people. They're rewarding people. They're uplifting Black scholars who do not have that question, those types of questions, at the crux and core of their intellectual being. And that's the problem. That we're paying people to fundamentally intellectually divest from our communities and our own people.
Woo, this was great, Dr. Curry. I'm gonna keep my promise, even though about three more questions popped up in my head while you were talking. But I'm gonna let you get to your family and
Yes, ma'am.
continue enjoying being with them, to visit with them. This has been so fulfilling. I definitely want to have you back because
Absolutely.
I do want to talk more about Black male studies, how organizers and activists such as myself can use that scholarship, because as we know, feminism and Black feminism in particular has definitely been exported out of the academy into popular
Yes, yes.
culture, into organizing spaces. And I would love to be able to do something similar with Black male studies. So you and I got a lot to talk
No, we
about.
we have a lot to talk about. But I got to tell you though, I just, I tune in from the UK when I can to see your show. I
I
love,
appreciate
I
you.
love the work that you've done. You were supporting me back when I was a lowly assistant professor. We were having great conversations.
That's
So I'm
right.
I'm just so happy to see that you've gotten these platforms and you've done so well, because we have, I really do think that Black people who genuinely care about other Black people are becoming rarer and rarer. And
That's sad.
it's so good to, yeah. And there's lots of Black women who reach out to me. That's why I don't take this stuff seriously that I see on social media. There's lots of Black women who reach out to me that say, thank you so much, read your book. It's helped me reach out and understand my son. It's helped me reach out, understand my husband, my boyfriend, etc. Right. The issue is about healing, because unlike these other variants of scholarship, you can read my work and you're like, wow, I didn't know Black women were doing this. We need to think about why this is happening. It's not, we have to get out of blaming Black people for the problems that Black people have. The issue is that we have to look at how structures are pushing people towards certain behaviors, even when they're self-destructive, right? And we have to approach our own people with a certain level of understanding and compassion. That doesn't mean that we don't hold people accountable. It means that we look at the social determinants, the psychological determinants that are causing them to act out violently, or in these negative ways, maladjusted ways towards their own group. And until we do that, right? This is why I'm always pushing mental health. Until we do that, we're just going to reproduce the pathological theories that white people have about us. And we can't, we're too much of an oppressed and beautiful people to have the views and the perspective of our oppressor determine our well-being. We simply just cannot do that.
We cannot do that. Thank you, Dr. Curry. I'll definitely reach out to have you back to dig more into Black male studies in particular. In the meantime, continue to enjoy your family while you're here visiting. And hopefully Hashem and I can catch up with y'all at some point.
Absolutely.
And as the world continues to open up. Thank you so much.
We'll make sure that happens.
Yeah, we're going to have to do it. Take care, everybody. We'll see y'all next week. Same place, same time.